Morning pushback is growing over a federal plan to buy warehouses across the U.S. and convert them into immigration detention centers. Maryland becoming the first state to file a lawsuit against DHS and ICE. The state is arguing the administration did not conduct an environmental review or hold public comment as required by law after it purchased a facility in Washington County. According to multiple reports, roughly 70,000 people are currently in immigration detention centers in the U.S., compared to about 40,000 just 1 year ago. But this latest plan by the White House is also drawing GOP backlash. MS Now reporter Nick McCool has more.
Amid a national crackdown on undocumented immigration,
we are ramping up detention capabilities and removal flights daily.
The Trump administration rapidly bolstering its detention capacity. ICE now buying up warehouses across the country, expected to be transformed into detention centers with an estimated cost in the tens of billions. But as the Trump administration's detention efforts expand,
free the children,
so too does the resistance to them. In a statement, the chairman of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Migration said these plans are deeply troubling, adding the thought of holding thousands of families in massive warehouses should challenge the conscience of every American. In a letter earlier this month to DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, Republican Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi saying he supports immigration enforcement broadly, but that a proposed center in his state forecloses economic growth opportunities. Wicker later announcing those plans were abandoned. In New Hampshire, pushback to another proposed ICE facility. Democrat Senator Maggie Hassan confronting ICE's acting director in D.C. earlier this month.
So will ICE similarly cancel the New Hampshire project based on these concerns and local opposition?
No, ma'am.
And in Michigan, Crain's Detroit Business reporting DHS purchased a 261,000 square foot facility outside the Motor City, adding local leaders are disappointed they'll lose out on jobs and tax revenue expected from the Toyota supplier originally planned to occupy the building.
We gotta fight back! We gotta fight back!
All of this as a new poll from the Washington Post, ABC News, and Ipsos finds nearly 6 in 10 U.S. adults disapprove of the president's handling of immigration. One potential reason why may lie inside the detention facilities already in operation.
Immigration detention conditions across the country are degrading and inhumane.
Elora Mukherjee and her students at Columbia Law School represent some of the detainees at a detention facility in Dilley, Texas.
Children and families alike have told me that they do not have access to sufficient clean drinking water, that they do not have access to sufficient nutritious food, that they have found worms, bugs, and mold in their meals.
Mukherjee describes her clients being held in areas lit 24/7, making it hard to sleep. She says one of her clients, an 18-month-old girl named Amalia, was sick there for weeks, rushed to the hospital and diagnosed with RSV, COVID, pneumonia, and bronchitis. She and her parents have since been released from ICE detention. In a statement, Ryan Gustin, Senior Director of Public Affairs for CoreCivic, which runs the Dilley facility, pushed back on Mukherjee's claims, calling allegations of food and water quality issues patently false, and saying the medical concerns raised simply do not reflect the hard work our staff does every day to get detainees care. He says detainees have round-the-clock access to emergency care and can sign up daily for medical care. But for some detainees around the country, Mukherjee says, the chance at staying in America is not worth the cost.
Conditions are so deplorable and unbearable that many non-citizens are giving up on their immigration cases. They cannot bear to spend another day in immigration detention.
In a statement, ICE told us the facilities purchased will meet its detention standards, bringing hundreds of jobs and millions in tax revenue. It also said sites go through community impact studies and due diligence to make sure there's no hardship on local utilities or infrastructure. It did not respond directly to the allegations at Dilley. Back to you.
All right, that's MS Now's Nick McCool, that report. You have so many things going on here. First of all, just the savage treatment that so many of these detainees are getting, that we get reports out of. A man from Northern Ireland who was held there for months and months basically said it was like a concentration camp. You have other stories of abuse, lights on around the clock, just the most savage, inhumane conditions in some of these facilities. And of course, you have DHS, who has lied to Americans time and time and time again. They've lied over and over and over again. So who is going to believe DHS? Who is going to believe ICE when they are lying about the conditions that so many of these detainees are being held in? Nobody. The answer is nobody. And yet it continues. And not only that, it expands. And Claire, my God, you have these industrialized internment camps. They're not detention centers. These are internment camps, except I really would like a historian to come on and compare Japanese internment camps of the 1940s to the condition in these internment camps. Because I think this may be even more extreme than those internment camps based on what history I've read so far. But this is absolutely savage. It's on an industrial scale. It's un-American. There's no transparency. And in the state of Michigan, DHS literally killed a Toyota parts plant from coming in that would have created jobs for working Americans. How screwed up are these priorities?
Well, first of all, is anybody surprised that these facilities are inhumane? I've been in detention facilities when I was in the Senate down near McAllen, Texas. And at that point in time, there were wire cages and people were held in a way that, frankly, was offensive to me. And it was nothing like what's being described now. And remember, what's weird about this, Joe, is they said only the worst of the worst is what they were going to go after. Well, how's that 18-month-old baby in there with any worst of the worst? To what extent are they separating out the minority of the people they've arrested are the worst of the worst that have had criminal charges for violent crime? Are they mixed in with these other families? And isn't the point they're trying to make is to make it so bad these people just say, we give up, as that attorney just was saying? Clearly, they're trying to get people to self-deport or decide, if I'm going to be treated like this in America, I don't want to be in America. And is that our values? Last time I checked, it was not. So I think the cases will work their way through court. I think they'll be found accountable, but it takes time. And meanwhile, people are more and more offended at the way in which they've gone about this, not securing the border, but what they've done in the interior country to people who have been here in this country for decades, and especially the children.
And people have been more and more outraged, going back to Minneapolis to be specific, about the way ICE agents have conducted themselves. Now, a former ICE Academy instructor is accusing the agency of gutting its training program as it ramps up mass deportation efforts. Ryan Schwenk, who resigned last week from an ICE training facility in Georgia, told a joint panel of House and Senate Democrats that the agency cut hours of mandatory training. He says key instruction was eliminated, including legal limits on the use of force, firearms safety, and proper arrest procedures.
On my first day, I received secretive orders to teach new cadets to violate the Constitution by entering homes without a judicial warrant. For the last 5 months, I watched ICE dismantle the training program, cutting 240 hours of vital classes from a 584-hour program. Classes that teach the Constitution, our legal system, firearms training, the use of force, lawful arrests, proper detention, and the limits of officers' authority.
Again, that was an ICE training instructor until a week ago. Schwenk provided lawmakers internal documents he says show the program was shortened from 72 days of training down to 42. Democrats argue the cuts came after Congress approved new funding to hire thousands more officers. The Department of Homeland Security, which oversees ICE, disputes that. In a statement, a DHS spokesperson says no training hours have been cut. Our officers receive extensive firearm training, are taught de-escalation tactics, and receive Fourth and Fifth Amendment comprehensive instruction. Again, that's the official word of the DHS, which has said a lot of things that have proven not to be true, Jonathan Lemire. But this goes to now right from the mouth of someone who did the training for ICE until a week ago to all the reporting we've had, including here at MS Now that says training has been cut, that in order to meet quotas, they have sped up the process of getting these agents out into the field without proper training.
Yeah, there's no question, first of all, that it's hard to imagine a government agency with less credibility right now than DHS, who's repeatedly lied in a number of high-profile moments, including the 2 fatal shootings in Minneapolis of a few weeks ago. But this is it. This is Democrats' concern. It's partially why there is a partial government shutdown right now, because the conduct of DHS and the funding there. There's going to be accelerated trainings. We know other agents getting ramped up now. And though Trump gave the order to pull back from Minnesota, and they did to a degree, although let's be clear, there are still agents on the streets there in the Twin Cities, including some pretty high-profile, tense confrontations. The overarching goal has not changed. The quotas set by Stephen Miller, these accelerated, extraordinary quotas of deportations, remain in place. And the only way that the agencies would be able to hit that number would be with the heavy-handed tactics that we have seen carried out by agents who, as we hear from this whistleblower, simply aren't trained. And it's that lack of experience, Joe and Mika, it's that lack of experience that's part of the problem with these confrontations. Now, one of the agents involved in the shootings, he was a veteran. He had been on the force. But it's a culture here, a culture of confrontation, people who don't quite know what they're doing, who aren't set to be in urban environments. That has led to these really tense standoffs in Minneapolis, but also cities across the country.
And these sort of whistleblower complaints are only going to continue. As we get further out from this and you have people trying to cover their ass, you're going to hear more and more people admitting what DHS, what Kristi Noem have been pushing them to try to do. Mika, there are times that I repeat things over and over and over again over time. I did it with Jeffrey Epstein back in 2015, 16, 17, going, why is this guy still out on the street? I don't get it. I kept repeating. Another thing I've been repeating time and time again is the numbers that the White House is pursuing for deportations cannot be achieved. And it causes a political disaster, not only for them, but for Republicans, because it causes a humanitarian disaster for so many people, including Americans, being gunned down in the streets of America. So the fact that the White House says, oh, we're going to change course, but they still are trying to reach numbers that are unreachable, that require violations of the Constitution, that require them to sweep street by street, community by community, neighborhood by neighborhood, city by... No. It's never going to work, and it's going to always be a political disaster. And the president's numbers are going to continue to go down until they change these numbers. The border is secure. The border is secure. Take it as a victory and go after the worst of the worst, which right now, according to Cato studies, constitute 7% of the people that they capture. That means 7% are the worst of the worst. The other 93%, little kids, grandmas, tourists who are here legally, people that they throw in to these internment camps that some people call concentration camps that have been there, right? This is inhumane, it's un-American, and it hurts the president politically. If they don't care about the humanity and the inhumanity of all, they should cynically care about the president's approval ratings. These numbers, these goals set out don't work.
Everything that we heard in that testimony is reflected by what is seen in every city that ICE has come to, in videos that are taken by citizens on the streets and reporting from on the ground. So it's kind of hard to push back on that testimony from that former ICE agent, whistleblower. Claire McCaskill and John Heilemann, thank you both very much.